Hello and welcome back to Chronicled, the history of Newcastle United. I'm Matt Ketchell, the North East Football App and Engagement Editor here at Chronicle Live, and we've reached episode 7 of our walk through the history of Newcastle United. Last week we covered 1909 to 1910, where Newcastle finally captured the FA Cup after failing to win 4 finals at the Old Crystal Palace. Today for episode 7, we're covering 1914 to 1918, which is of course World War I, and we'll be discussing how this affected the club. As ever, I'm joined by Paul Joannou, Newcastle United's official club historian, and joining us is Dr. Alexander Jackson, who not only works as a curator at the National Football Museum, he's also a Newcastle United supporter as well. Alex, we'll start with you. First of all, welcome to the podcast. Delighted to have you with us. Can you give us a bit of a background on your history as a Newcastle United supporter and the work you do at the fantastic National Football Museum in Manchester?
Yes, well, thanks for having me on the show. I'm a curator at the museum, which is great because I get to essentially work with all the objects, helping look after them and interpret them for display and work with the public with them. As you've mentioned, I'm a Newcastle United supporter, which is it makes basically I'm in my dream job, probably a few other people's dream job as well. And that goes back to the fact my dad was from Newcastle. So obviously you can tell from my accent I wasn't raised there, but I was brought up in Sheffield. But each year we go up to my granddad's in Whitley Bay and then head up to the game from theirs. And he was from Stanley in County Durham. And actually he's a link to the First World War because his name was Victor. And they named him that because he was born on the 9th of November 1918.
Oh, man.
So instead of calling him John after his dad, like all the others had been in the family, they called him after that, so to speak. So, yeah.
Brilliant. And then you work as a curator as well at the National Football Museum. Tell us a bit about what that might involve day to day.
It's great because it involves a bit of everything. Like sometimes I might be working on an exhibition, like our recent one on the Hall of Fame, where we might be working with new objects that come in from like star players. Other times it's looking after things behind the scenes. So some great Newcastle United items there in our archives that we preserve and care for, like Vic Keeble's 1955 FA Cup winners medal, which is brilliant. And then just great stuff, which is answering inquiries from the public, questions, also the great stuff that they bring and donate to the museum. So yeah, it's brilliant because every week is different and there's always something new that I learn every day.
Amazing. I'm jealous. Surrounded by historic football memorabilia. It sounds like a brilliant spot to be in. Paul, I sense this is going to be a big episode for us. World War I and Newcastle United, something of a specialist area for you, isn't it? You brought the book out to mark the centenary of the Great War in 2018, To the Glory of God, Newcastle United and the Great War. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Yes, well, at the time I knew something about Newcastle United and the Great War, but not enough, not very much at all at that time. And throughout the centenary of the 4 years of World War I, there was an awful lot on the TV, and I decided to look into it a bit more deeply. And I spent 2 years researching and putting together a full detailed review of Newcastle United, the club, and all the players from 1914 to 1919 who were involved in the Great War. How the club coped and how the footballers coped with the conflict. And not just the first teamers, it was all the young reserves and the ex-players and future players. So it was a lovely and tragic story to look into, and that's the end result was a book on the whole subject.
And Alex, you've written a book titled Football's Great War that is all about the period we're talking about today. Can you tell us a bit about that one too?
Yeah, so a bit like Paul, I knew a bit about this, and then in 2014 we did a centenary exhibition about football and the Great War, and that was really great in terms of researching, getting to develop my knowledge, and we uncovered some great stories, and it was a really interesting exhibition. It kind of it bit me a little bit, and the one bit which really I thought was interesting was that there'd been relatively little written around the home front, because a lot of these stories were about the players who'd gone to the front and those kind of that side of the conflict. But football still continued, and so I kind of decided madly a little bit in my own spare time over the last 7 years or so to like research it. So hopefully my book is coming out early spring of next year, and sort of exploring that sort of across England, that story, what went on.
Look forward to it. So we have two absolute experts on football and World War One. So let's talk about how this huge event in human history affected Newcastle United specifically. Paul, coming to you, Newcastle had enjoyed a decade of mastery, as we called it, and they were renowned for their ambition on and off the field prior to World War One. Presumably this halted as war broke out in 1914.
Yes, just about. As the new season began, the conflict erupted more or less at the same time, which really put an end to Newcastle United's rebuilding plans after that decade of Edwardian mastery. Remarkably, looking back now, the game actually continued for the whole season as soldiers went to the Western Front in Belgium and France and elsewhere, and they were being killed in their thousands. But football here at home continued, and that eventually proved hugely controversial.
And you've got some talking points on the controversy as well, Alex, that was surrounding this period of time in terms of Britain and football in general.
Yeah, it's arguably sort of, well, actually until the recent pandemic, it was arguably the most controversial period in the game's history, really, because on the one hand, the government had this business as normal, as usual message that it sent out, trying to reassure the nation, trying to stop economic disruption. So they wanted people to keep going about their everyday lives. And at the same time, they needed to raise a mass army, because until 1916, they relied entirely on volunteers to join the forces, as opposed to countries in the rest of Europe who had mass conscript armies. So they needed to bring more men into the army. And so you had football continuing with these big civilian crowds. And some people were opposed to this. Some were opponents of football before the war, and they thought it was just morally, they thought just football was wrong to begin with. But other people thought also it was like morally wrong to see football continuing. And on the other side, you had people who thought football should continue to help things on the home front, to reassure civilians, to provide entertainment for troops. And so you kind of get a very bitter sort of controversial arguments raging. And a great example is the Earl of Durham, who gives a recruiting speech at Sunderland in November 1914. And he's very fed up, and he says he'd rather wish the Germans dropped some bombs in Roker Park to encourage everyone to sort of join the forces and realise where their priorities are. But at the same time, there are some members of the crowd who aren't applauding, like a lot of the people there, who are amateur footballers, and they asked the Durham Football Association to do a census essentially of who's joined up, and it shows that by the end of the season 75 to 74% of local amateur footballers in the northeast have joined up. So it's quite a complex situation where different people's on different sides of it have got very different views.
Paul, specifically, how were Newcastle United impacted by this period?
Well, like all clubs throughout the country, as the football was played out, United were hit very hard financially. Dates dropped alarmingly over the season, and many clubs feared they would go out of existence, they would go bankrupt. Now, Newcastle weren't one of them. They were still fairly secure. But rival Sunderland very nearly did go bankrupt. They also had to finance a new stand that they built, and it was only thanks to the directors, the players, and a lot of fans that they survived. In terms of football, Newcastle struggled in league action, but they did have a sort of mini FA Cup run, and should have reached the latter stages, but they lost to Chelsea on Tyneside after a replay. So it wasn't a great season football-wise, but events off the field overtook matters as the season developed.
And presumably the focus shifted at some point during the 1914-15 season, and these footballers enlisted to fight as the situation escalated.
Yes, during the season, many footballers around the country, both professional and amateurs, started to join up in terms of volunteer for the forces. Lord Kitchener's call to arms around the country arrived later in 1914 and into 1915, and the so-called PALS battalions were formed around the country. And on Tyneside, United players joined in the Northumberland Fusiliers and the DLI in Durham as new units were formed. And on Tyneside, especially the Newcastle Commercials were formed. And Newcastle United players joined up, including emerging winger Tommy Goodwill, and he was a real talent.
Yeah, we'll talk about Tommy in a bit of detail later on in the episode. Alex, can you tell us some of the specific players from the 1914 Newcastle squad who swapped their football boots for army boots and joined up?
Yeah, well, what you have, as Paul was mentioning, the PALS battalions, and so one of the most sort of famous in football terms is the Footballers Battalion, which is raised in December 1914, and it's kind of a response to the controversy that we were discussing before. And so that's quite something where you have essentially they were encouraging players and fans across the country to come together. And so there's about half a dozen former or current or future Newcastle United players who join up, including forward George Pike. And at the first meeting, there's also a northeastern link in the sense that 10 players from Clapton Orient join up as almost practically a team together at that first meeting, which is kind of like an image synonymous with that sort of period of like friends joining up together. And that included, sorry, bear with me a second. Just my brain stops a little bit. William Jonas, who's a former Northumberland miner from Northumberland. He moved down to London, was a really popular member of the team down there, and he joined up with a lot of his mates, and he was one of about 900 who were killed were serving with the battalion on the Western Front during the First World War.
And in Scotland, there was a similar movement as well, Paul.
Yes, actually just before the Footballers Battalion in London was formed, Edinburgh raised its own battalion called McRae's Battalion, and that included many Hearts players joined up, amongst others, and one very famous future Newcastle FA Cup winner was included, Jimmy Lowe, who won the trophy in 1924, and they fought alongside the Footballers Battalion in many of the conflicts on the Western Front.
And staying with you, Paul, at what point did matches stop being played due to the war?
Well, it was at the very end of the season. The 1914-15 campaign finished, and it was played out, but it was inevitable that the game would close down completely due to the mounting criticism and, of course, the financial difficulties that every club faced. And that's what happened, really. Newcastle United rolled down the shutters and, in effect, went into mothballs, as did Sunderland and Middlesbrough in the northeast. Elsewhere, regional wartime football continued, but due to the really difficult travelling arrangements for northeast clubs, no top clubs took part in those regional competitions.
And presumably, players stopped being professional footballers, and their income supply changed from Newcastle United, and they joined the cause in one way or another.
Well, yes, all the players' contracts, all the professionals, the contracts were cancelled. They didn't get paid, so they had to initially find work somewhere else, and they started to join up with the forces. Eventually, when conscription arrived, all be employed in the many munition factories on Tyneside. And I traced, when I researched into the club's players, over 160 United players and officials, present, past and future, served in the forces, and many, many more were engaged in essential war work, either down the pits, the shipyards, or in the many munition factories along the Tyne and Wear.
Alex, was there ever any suggestion that football could somehow continue while war went on, or was that always out there question?
Yeah, well, in the summer of 1915, I suppose mentioned. So yes, the northeastern clubs decided that they were sort of essentially like going to not take part, because there were these big debates about whether you could continue, whether it was right to continue, and so the FA went for stopping professionalism to essentially remove any of the criticism, but they essentially left it up to the clubs to decide whether they did continue. And so quite a lot of the football clubs formed these regional leagues. And it was really fascinating reading Paul's book during my research, because there was a bit of debate at Newcastle about whether they'd rejoin them at some point, which was fascinating. But for quite a number of clubs, they played in these regional leagues throughout the war. There was about over 1 million spectators each season. So it kind of goes to show the game still had this kind of big interest for people. And what was quite interesting was obviously a lot of sort of soldiers were still coming back from the Western Front on leave or wounded, and they're taking the chance when they could to see their teams play, which you can imagine if you're sort of going through that kind of really traumatic experience, being able to connect with your civilian life from before the war is really important. And so obviously it's quite tricky if you're a Newcastle United fan because you haven't got Newcastle games taking place to watch. So what they did was I've come across some lovely references to Newcastle fans being particularly pleased to see Leeds City play if they were in their sort of local area, because they had a lot of Newcastle United players who'd gone to play for them. And so there's a lovely account of like when the players get on the ball, Newcastle or Geordies in the army shouting now United instead of like now City. Which was I just thought was just this really lovely insight into how the guys had just taken this brief chance to connect with their former lives.
Yeah, that's great. Do we know how many Newcastle players or staff lost their lives in World War One, Paul?
Yes, I've certainly managed to track all Newcastle's ex-players and players at the time of the Great War who were sadly killed. There was 23, which is an awful lot, who died as a result of the conflict, and included was a VC winner. Several were killed on the very first day of the Battle of the Somme, and during that battle in France, which raged for several weeks. So, there was a lot of Newcastle players involved, and sadly, as I say, 23 died.
Wow, that's amazing. Can you tell us any more about those players who were actually involved in the Battle of the Somme itself?
Yeah, well, at the height of the early part of the Great War, a huge Allied offensive took place along the Western Front in July 1916. By then, all of the PALS battalions that were formed had gone through training and were now in France and Belgium, and they formed very much part of that battle. And no fewer than 10 United men were killed in the lengthy battle. Two teammates side by side on the opening charge over the top on July the 1st. They were both with the Newcastle Commercials, and Tommy Goodwill, first teamer, very popular player, and reserve fullback Dan Dunglinson were killed side by side as they went over the top. Also be killed was another reserve defender, Donald Bell, who was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest honour any soldier could be awarded.
That's amazing. And can you talk a little bit more about Tommy Goodwill? Because he probably would have gone on to enjoy a really successful career at the club had he returned home safely from war.
Yeah, well, he was a local lad. He hailed from Bates Cottages near Cramlington, and he joined Newcastle from local football, and he found a place on the left wing during 1913-14 and 1914-15. And he was a very talented player, fast with an eye for goal. Many judges at the time tipped him even for international honours. He was so well respected. But his career was of course halted by the Great War, and he played 60 games for Newcastle, scored 6 goals, and he was a hugely popular player with the crowd, being a local lad.
Yeah, I bet. And amazing to hear that a player associated with the club, Donald Bell, was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. Alex, Paul tells me that Donald Bell's medal is actually at the National Football Museum. What can you tell us about Donald?
Yes, it's one of our key star items on display there. So yeah, Donald was a school teacher, so he played for Newcastle as an amateur earlier in his career. And by 1914, he was also a professional with Bradford Park Avenue, who aren't a name that actually are familiar to too many people. But back in 1914, they were actually a first division club. Bradford had 2 big professional sides, and he was at Park Avenue. He also believed that he should join up, and at the start of the war, he asked permission from the directors, and they released him from his contract, and he signed up very early. He became an officer, and he served in the Princess of Wales East Yorkshire Regiment. And so at the Battle of the Somme, he was leading his men across sort of open terrain from their trenches to the opposition. And there was heavy machine gun fire coming down, and so he let out to the open with 2 of his men. and he proceeded to move towards the enemy with grenades and bombed out essentially the enemy positions, so his men could then get into the trenches without heavy casualties. And so he was recommended for this. He was very modest. He wrote home to his parents saying, "Oh, it's just a fluke. I didn't do much." And sadly, 5 days after he'd committed that act of gallantry, he was killed doing a very similar feat, shot by a sniper. And so his medal was auctioned in 2010 and was bought by the Professional Footballers Association. And so it's been at the museum. And it's, for me, it's an amazing item because in 2014, we actually were requested to take it to the site of his grave as part of a commemorative event organised by most of the football bodies. So it was quite a strange experience of taking that particular item to that particular spot where he's buried, which is it's something in my career that I'll remember quite for a long time.
Wow, that's incredible to hear about Donald. He sounds like an incredible personality, and it's fantastic that his medal is still here and people are able to see it. Paul, do we know which specific corners of the world Newcastle United players were sent to during World War One?
Yeah, we certainly do. I've managed to trace the military records of dozens of the players that served, and it was not only in France and Belgium. That's where the majority of the footballers served on the Western Front. But United's men were also in the Balkans. There was a lot of fighting around there, the Middle East, in Russia, India, and on the seas in the Royal Navy, of course, including the notable Battle of Jutland at the start of the war.
And staying with you, Paul, were any games of football played at St James's Park at all between the club being mothballed and the war ending?
Yes, Newcastle and other clubs did play the odd game of football at St James's Park and locally in 1915, 16 and 17, 18. They played a handful of war charity matches, but it was with scratch lineups, really. Weren't formal Newcastle United games. Players were scattered all over the country, so they just had to grab which footballers were available. United's teams during the height of the war were organised by Bill McCracken, who worked at the Armstrong's munition factory, and he put together what was called an all-star team. But really, it wasn't until 1917-18 that the club decided to resume operations of sorts. The first formed a junior 11 titled the Newcastle Swifts, and that was with the aim of finding new talent in the Northeast in readiness for a return to football normality.
And was St James's Park itself requisitioned by the army and the government during the war?
It was during the early part of the war years. St James's Park was taken over by the artillery, and they had guns and horses even stabled in the old West Stand. And Newcastle weren't allowed to visit the ground for most of the week. They were allowed during that 1914-15 season to go. I think it was on a Friday and on a Saturday for matches. And after the professional football closed down, the ground was used for many events, charity events, athletics, carnivals, boxing. There was choral singing. There was a famous royal visit when 60,000 attended in 1917 when the King and Queen presented medals to soldiers. And there was many local matches, munition football teams played there. And as football really still thrived locally along Tyneside and Wearside, there was many work sides, which were of course made up of many professional footballers now engaged in essential work.
I see. And Alex, how did non-professional football do during this time? I'm thinking of the amateur game, younger teams maybe, and the women's game as well.
Yeah, as Paul was mentioning, sort of you still got a lot of those big names still in the area if they're in civilian jobs connected with the war. And so it was really nice when I was doing research for the book, sort of finding out how they you could go down to your semi-professional level where some of the clubs were still playing. like Wallsend and South Shields, and you'd get sort of what was lovely was getting these descriptions of how some of the Newcastle United fans migrated from St James's when there weren't the games every Saturday to these clubs through 1915-16 season and 16-17 season, where they could see their former stars in different colours, so to speak. There's a lovely description how they're turning up described as being a bit like tourists who've gone down to London for the cup final, sort of wandering around, sort of unfamiliar with everything. And after a few weeks, they consider themselves like proper regulars. They've been going to Wallsend for like ages, so they're all used to it, which was a lovely little image. I wonder what the Wallsend regulars thought of all these Newcastle United fans who decided to come down. And then, as you mentioned, the women's football, it's a really amazing, important time in the history of the women's game. And women's football starts becoming more popular, starts emerging more in 1916. Starts some of the early games are down in Portsmouth, but by 1917 and across 18, it's been played in quite a number of places across the country. And arguably, the hotbed where there's the most interest, the most teams, the most players is actually the northeast of England. There's over 70 teams. You have these really well organised, popular munitionettes cups, as they're called, after the jobs that the women had in the munitions factories. And so they're getting crowds for the finals across 1917-18, which includes one at St James's, like 20,000, 22,000. So it really goes to show at that point how women's football as a spectator event was becoming more popular. But sadly, after the war, the FA introduces a ban in 1921 that stops FA-affiliated clubs hosting women's games and kind of puts the women's game back and makes it very hard for it to continue. So it's kind of this lost moment almost in Northeast football history, in the sense of that there was this thriving scene that perhaps could have developed into a really great game, but sadly wasn't to be.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear that. You don't really associate this period with women's football, and it does sound like it was, one step forward, two steps back, which is a shame. Paul, any other interesting stories that emerged from this fascinating period that you can share with us too?
Well, there are many what could be termed interesting war stories relating to Newcastle players and officials as well. Far too many to mention, but I will highlight a couple. There was a United reserve fullback, played one game for the senior team, a chap called Jack Thomas. He was a Durham miner from Sacriston. He joined up with the Durham Light Infantry with several workmates, one of the PALS battalions, and he was very quickly into action around Ypres in 1915 in Belgium. He took part in a fierce battle. He was captured, became a prisoner of war, but Jack was determined to escape, and he tried a few times, got caught and re-prisoned, but he eventually succeeded with the help of a hidden compass, believe it or not, in a food parcel which was sent back from Sacriston to the camp. He escaped with 4 French colleagues, and he risked life to get back to the UK, but he reached the Dutch border and he managed to get a boat back to England, but his troubles didn't end there, because the British thought he was a spy for the Germans. He was one of the very first to escape and reach the UK, and they didn't believe that he could get back himself, but he eventually persuaded them that he was very much a Allied soldier, and he became very much a respected soldier, and they thought he could be used. The military thought he could be used again on the Western Front in France and in Belgium. So they put him into the intelligence corps, which were very much an early version of MI5 and MI6 and all that. So he was sent back to the continent as a sort of 007 agent on counter-espionage work around Dieppe and Le Havre, tracking down German agents. And he was successful in that, and he was eventually awarded the MSM, a high-ranking medal, And after the war, he played a little bit of football. He was with Brighton and Spennymoor, and then went back to the pits. So, and he told his story in his local church newspaper, which has survived to this day. And when I met the family, they managed to give me a copy of the whole various episodes of his story, which related his detailed account of World War One. So that's one very interesting tale. The other one covers a famous United director and chairman of the future, William McKeag, who was a very prominent, or became a very prominent Newcastle citizen, Lord Mayor, and famous in the boardroom at Newcastle United in the 50s and 60s, and the father of the later chairman, Gordon McKeag. And he was a teenager fighting the Bolsheviks, which is a rather forgotten conflict of the Great War. He was only 17 years old when he joined up, volunteered, and he joined into the Army Service Corps. But he wanted action on the continent rather than sitting behind a desk in the UK. So he volunteered for the British forces to assist the White Russians fight the Bolsheviks in Russia as the Civil War raged there, as a sort of side issue to the Great War. So he went 1918 to Russia, joined the fight as they headed for Moscow. He was badly wounded, but still promoted to warrant officer, and he became the youngest in the British Army, and he was awarded the MSM as well, and also high-ranking Russian honours. And William came back. He came back just virtually 21 years old, and eventually became a politician and Newcastle United director. And he also served in World War II as a staff officer. So his story is a really interesting one as well.
Yeah, some life. And any others to add to that?
Oh well, there's really dozens. One of the other ones would be Dick Little, who was a fullback at Newcastle United before the war, and he served in the Royal Navy, and eventually became one of the sailors on the Grand Fleet in the North Sea when they encountered the German fleet in the very early months of the war. It was feared that the German fleet would become a huge nuisance to the British forces, but there was just a massive battle in the North Sea between the Grand Fleet and the German fleet, and Dick Little was one of those sailors on board one of the destroyers accompanying the big battleships. He survived and went on to have a decent career in the game. Great,
good to hear. How was the normality marked? How was the return to normality marked in football circles, Paul, when the war did end?
Yeah, well, as 1918 sort of developed, there was much hope that the terrible war would at last end, and it did. And of course, we all know on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, it came to an end. Unfortunately, though, United players were killed to the end. Young reserve Owen McManus died on the 6th of November, which was very close to the end. And a former inside forward from Gateshead, Cliff Winter, he died a month earlier in October. And they were tragic deaths, so close to peace being restored. Yeah. And to mark the very end of the Great War, although the Russian Civil War fighting continued into 1919 with William McKeag involved, football returned with what were called victory matches around the country. And in the Northeast, the Northern Victory League was arranged between local clubs. So we had Newcastle, Sunderland, Middlesbrough all returning to action, Darlington, Hartlepool, Scotswood, Durham City and South Shields taking part in a mini league in January to March 1919.
And Alex, once the dust settled, how did football as an organised concept look as plans to resume for the 1919-20 season were made?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So they reinstitute the national leagues as they'd had before the start of the war, so the regional leagues go, and you do get a post-war boom in the immediate few seasons after the war. So the game really takes off. That's that pent-up interest amongst all the soldiers coming back. Some soldiers who've discovered football that weren't interested in it, but discovered it playing it whilst in France. But it's also quite tough for the clubs in terms of how they, and the players especially, in terms of how they approach it, because obviously you've got guys who have potentially coming back who are just too old to continue, young players you haven't seen for 3 or 4 years, and sort of slightly outside the Newcastle context, but across at Sunderland, there's some quite poignant stories where they had 2 players called Jimmy Seed and Tom Wilson. They were both essentially teenagers, young men who joined up as volunteers in 1915. They served their country at the front. They came back. Jimmy Seed had been gassed. Tom Wilson had bashed his knee whilst taking food up to the front lines under enemy fire, and both of them came back. Each played a game or so, and were written off by the club directors who thought they just weren't good enough to keep on. There was no point, and so both of them were given free transfers. But fortunately, they sort of went on. Jimmy Seed went down to South Wales, resurrected his career there, was a cup winner with Tottenham within a few seasons. Tom Wilson went to Huddersfield, and he played alongside another player called Samuel Wadsworth from Blackburn Rovers, who again joined. He lied about his age to join up because he was too young, and he came back again, sort of having been wounded. And so Tom Wilson played alongside Samuel Wadsworth, and they won 3 back-to-back titles with Huddersfield Town, and also an FA Cup winners' medal. And all 3 became in England internationals. So they're the sort of the lucky stories that we know about guys who overcame those obstacles. But for obviously a lot of players who may have come back, been rejected, and that would have been it. Perhaps a promising career in 1914 was no longer to be had in 1918, which is 1919. So it's fascinating because we're still exploring those stories and finding out more about them.
And Paul, who did Newcastle face in their first official game back after World War One?
Well, United had to travel to London and to face Arsenal when the season reopened, and it was the biggest crowd of the day, 55,000. So United win 1-0. The Magpies, in fact, went on to have a very good season with several new youngsters in the side and a handful of the Edwardian greats such as Bill McCracken and Jimmy Lawrence still in the side. At one point, they were challenging for the title, but fell short in the last couple of months, finishing in 8th position.
And financially, did it take long for Newcastle to recover?
Not really. Finances improved rapidly. The gates jumped from a low point in 1914 of an average of 18,000 to over 37,000. Money was soon to flow back into the United bank account, and the Magpies were to splash out again in the transfer market. And they became one of the best sides during the 20s in English football.
Very good. And Newcastle fans listening might remember that the club fairly recently moved to create a more prominent memorial at St James's Park to honour the players, staff and officials who lost their lives in World War One. In 2018, you had some involvement in that, didn't you, Paul?
Yes, certainly did. We managed to design and create a much bigger memorial to those players who were killed in the Great War. There was an original Roll of Honour erected way back in 1920, but that only really covered those men who were on the club's staff at the time and didn't include former players to be killed. So in November 2018, as the centenary of the conflict closed, United unveiled a much larger and imposing marble memorial to United's players. It's situated next to the club's main atrium entrance on Barrack Road, and it also covers and remembers those who were killed in World War II.
Yeah, and for people watching on video on YouTube, we can reveal a picture of that memorial here, which is, like you say, it'll be familiar to regular matchday goers at St James's Park. And having listened to you both chat about the impact the World War had on Newcastle, I look forward to having a closer look at this next time I'm outside the stadium. and remembering the impact the war had on our football club. Thank you both, Alex. It's been great to have you with us. Is there anything else you'd like to add? But fantastic to have your expertise as a curator at the National Football Museum and someone with an expert on the World War and a Newcastle United fan.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on the show. And if I was going to add one thing, it's obviously if you are in Manchester and fancy a visit to the National Football Museum, please do come by. We'd love to see you there. And there's some lovely Newcastle United material on display, as well as a lot of other interesting material as well. So yeah, thanks again.
Absolutely. So there we are, a big episode, Newcastle and World War One. Huge thanks to you both. Do seek out Paul and Alex's books on World War One. I'll put some details for those in the description. And when circumstances allow, you must visit the National Football Museum. It's one of my favourite places in the world. A fantastic place. Lots of Newcastle United memorabilia there, as Alex says, in amongst all the other fantastic exhibits on display. And we'll be back next week to talk about Newcastle United's first ever visit to Wembley, and spoiler alert, another FA Cup win, so that's going to be a good one. In the meantime, please subscribe to the Everything is Black and White podcast via whichever podcast platform you use. Follow Chronicle Live's Newcastle United channels on social media. We're at Chronicle NUFC on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, and keep an eye out for new episodes of Chronicled, the history of Newcastle United, every week. If you have a history question about Newcastle, we have the perfect person to answer here. Email those to the theEIBWpodcast at reachplc.com. I'll pick out some of the best for future shows and we might put them to Paul and he can try and answer them. Lastly, stay up to date with everything black and white by subscribing to our Newcastle United newsletter. It's free. You get a morning news roundup, an evening news roundup, and breaking news as and when it happens directly emailed to your inbox. The link is in the show notes. Hit that, scroll down to Sport, Newcastle United updates, tick the box and you'll be signed up. Thanks so much for listening to Chronicled, the history of Newcastle United, with me, Matt Ketchell, Paul Joannou and Dr. Alexander Jackson.